Welcome to the Principal Podcast. This is X.A. Anderson. Today I am honored to have with us Barbara Mojica. Barbara is an author, an educator, a parent, and Barbara provides tools to inspire, educate, and entertain youth. She believes and knows that history is a key to solving many of today's problems. On her profile that I've got here says, "Are you tired of being bombarded by social media? Accept the challenge, be a truth teller." Barbara, thank you for joining us today. We're excited to learn from you.
Well, my pleasure. I'm excited to talk to your listeners.
So tell us this, you believe strongly in history. So my question is, why should people learn history? Like, why should anyone care?
Okay, well, that gets me going. Well, because if you know history, to me, knowing history equals understanding, because we cannot possibly fathom how we got to where we are today, or to make a plan for creating a better scenario tomorrow if we don't understand how we got here in the first place. And everything in the world has a history. So we are not born at the beginning of something. When we're born really in the middle of a story, because we're born into a family, and that family has members and our ancestors who have come before us. And then, of course, there will be those that come after us. And the first thing we do when we are young children is we ask those who, what, when, where, and why questions. We want to know, who am I? Where did I come from? Oh, what happened before? How have things changed? So we ask all of those questions, and we eventually have a better grounding of where we are in our family and what our families stand for. And then as we get a little bit older, we understand that there's a whole community around us, that there are a group of people who have come together and worked together because they have common interests, a common language, a common culture, common traditions. And we learn to react and to participate in that larger group. And eventually that goes out into the larger world. We learn that we're not just a part of this local community, but we're part of a larger group. We're part of a country. We're citizens in that country. We have certain obligations. And then, of course, that goes out even wider. We recognize that there's a big old world out there, and we are a part of that larger world as well.
That's wonderful. And part of the things that many of our viewers here are parents, and we've talked about this. You and I have talked about this. We've talked about this with our viewers more than once, that we are the CEOs of our children's education. A lot of times as parents, we think it's just the job to send our kids off to school and hope and pray that they get educated in the way that we would be best for them. But I think that's a paradigm that doesn't work as well as saying, you know what, I'm the CEO and I'm going to take responsibility for teaching my kids, including the history, so they understand. Like you said, one of the things I like that you said was, the key to a lot of our problems is understanding our history. So talk to me a little bit about that. If we're trying to solve today's problems, how does our history, can we talk about that a little bit more in depth? How does that help solve the problems of today?
Well, today we are living in a world in which a lot of our basic values and our grounding is has been kind of torn apart or rendered uh, difficult, because we have managed to divide ourselves into different groups. And it's more important than ever for parents to take charge and to make sure that their children are learning the values and the skills that are important to their particular family, to their particular group and culture. And I think today, especially after COVID, when we became so isolated, children have never been more impacted by this isolation, and they are seeking to belong, but they are kind of lost because today social media has made it so important for our children and adults as well. But for our children, they seek this belonging. Of course, all children, as they are growing and gaining independence, want to be more on their own, and they want to sometimes rebel against what seems to be the norm. But today, there's so much confusion because of social media. Children, because they have all of these pressures on social media, they're trying to fit in with their peer groups, and social media is giving them a sense, a false sense of security because they're only seeing part of the picture. They're not being given the facts. They're being given a certain limited number of uh, approaches by the algorithm. And the more they seek to fit in with their group, the more their approaches are limited. So they're not seeing the whole picture. And during COVID, parents became aware that a lot of the values that they may have thought were being carried forth in the educational system are no longer being carried forth. And they became aware that their children were being taught things that may or may not be aligned with their values. And they wanted to take more control. So today, I think more and more parents are becoming involved in their education, and
It's a good thing, right?
they're being they're noticing that history is no longer being taught as a priority. It's very much, in fact, ignored in our educational system. The values of good citizenship and the values of taking responsibility, of respecting other people, of learning about different cultures and having respect for differences other than our own. A lot of that has been kind of molded into this one way of doing things. And this is what our schools, the public schools especially, are pushing. So a lot of parents became aware that, hey, there's a lot going on that I didn't know about. And uh, children were being pushed into certain avenues of thought that they may not agree with. And the parents feel as if I think a large number of parents feel as if they have lost control. They're no longer the CEOs. Parents are a child's first teacher, and the parents are the ones who are ultimately responsible for the education of the child in terms of not only academics but of the moral values, the intrinsic belief system that their culture and their family imports to them. So parents have somewhat been trying to turn this tide around and have taken more active roles in education by speaking up at school boards, by pushing back against things that they think are not appropriate to be taught in the curriculums and so on. And history is a large part of that because when history is taught in the curriculum, children learn how to do that critical thinking, how to not only learn the facts of what happened, which is probably the least important part of history, but to learn how to think and assess and evaluate, to to analyze, and then to be able to take the information presented and to put it together and to infer and create their own opinions about things using objective information, not using the opinion pieces that we get from social media.
I really appreciate that. And it's refreshing for me, Barbara, to hear you. I mean, my understanding is you're a lifelong educator. You've been a principal of a school. You've been involved in the education system for a long time. And to hear you say the parents are the CEOs, or the parents are their first, the first and most important teacher, I think, as you say, that, I think there's this feeling that has kind of come about in some areas where it's kind of like, well, maybe I'm not as important. The unspoken feeling in some school districts is we kind of own your kids. We're going to teach them what we want to teach them. And you're kind of just the caretaker. And you're saying, actually, no, you're the first and most important teacher. And we need to step up and teach these values, these skills, which are more important than just the facts or teaching to the test or teaching to get the kids to pass, and so they can get the benchmarks that people want them to hit. And this also, that this thought of history is being lost. We a lot of history classes they don't even call it history anymore. Sometimes there's called social studies or something else.
Exactly.
Where we're not actually discussing, hey, this is the history of how to be a good citizen. And to have parents need to step up and say, hey, we need to make sure this is taught, the history, so we understand where we're coming from in our country. But would you do agree with that? It sounds like this principle that parents are the CEOs. They are the first and most important teacher, even more so than the schools. Not to say schools don't play a huge part in this. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes. And I think
that's coming from you, an educator.
Yeah. Well, I became over the, I started teaching when I was actually 20 years old. And I spent almost 40 years in education. I started out in general education with children in the general population, and I taught first in the private school, and I learned over time. It became more and more evident to me that there were so many different ways of learning, and in general, the school that I worked in was failing to meet the needs of kids that learn differently. So I went into special education, and from there, I took a whole new certification in special ed, and I learned how to work with children who had very, very unique and special needs. So everything, autism, crack cocaine, physical disabilities, and so on. And I worked then with even a large group of teachers who were not only academic teachers, but were physical therapists and occupational therapists and psychologists, a whole team approach to learning. And that made me aware that our children are truly unique, and all children are special, whether they have a quote physical disability or a learning disorder. But they can all learn if they are reached in a unique and special way. And here we are pushing the Common Core, and everyone must meet the standard. Everyone must pass this certain test. And if we meet these benchmarks, then we can say that we are delivering a quality education. But we're not delivering a quality education, because over the past 20 years in the United States, our position in education went from being right up there at the top to like we're below number 20 now. So in all this effort to throw money at the problem and to say that we are going to bring every student up to standard, we've done just the opposite. And we've created teachers whose in many cases their hands are tied. They are restricted to teaching in a very regimented way. They are required to collect data all the time. And they spend more time going to staff trainings for new ideas and new approaches, many of which are thrown out shortly after that. And they're spending less time in the classroom. They're spending more time pushing paper, and our children are not being successful at learning. So I part of it, there are all kinds of forces involved. There's politics involved. There are large companies who produce educational materials who are pushing their agenda. There's all kinds of grant money that comes from the federal government or the state government, and the schools want to obtain this grant money, and then they are forced to adhere to very strict guidelines as to what they're going to do with that money. So
So they're
none of
given
this,
money. They're given money, but there's hooks attached to it.
yes, there's
Here's the
always a
money.
hook
Yeah,
attached. Yes.
always a hooks attached. Interesting to hear that. Here's the money, but you better teach it the way we want it taught. And if you don't, then you don't get the money.
And then on top of that, there's this new emphasis on the quote social emotional learning. And almost, most of the states have requirements that we teach children these what they call social emotional skills. Uh, and the social emotional learning again may conflict with the parents' core values and beliefs. And a lot of this grant money goes to that, which also takes even more time, away from the academic curriculum.
So then the question is, this is a pivotal question in our time right now. Do the schools own your kids, or should parents be the CEOs of their children's education? And I mean, should the parents be the CEOs, or should they just say, hey, the schools own our kids and we're just kind of caretakers?
Well, I think the parents have to push back. I think that uh, if they don't push back, our educational system is going to be in even more trouble than it is today, because so many kids are being left behind. We have such a diverse population here in the United States. We have so many different threads that pull at this public education system. We have children who have different cultures that are very alien to the American system of education. They're, they come from families in which they're being taken care of in a lot of cases by members of the family who are not even their parents. So we have a lot of these families where the grandparents are taking care of the kids because the parents are working two jobs, and they may be working 10, 12 hours a day. They the grandparents or the other members of the family who are taking care of the children probably don't even speak the English language. So it's taking longer and longer for these children to become, accustomed to their surroundings. I can remember a case um, before I retired. There were times when we had to go to siblings in the family to go home and give a message to translate, because there was virtually no adult in the family that understood English. So we would have to, choose an older brother or sister to deliver a message. We have children that have all kinds of other barriers to learning. There are behavioral issues because children who are not accustomed to the way our society works often act out and rebel against it simply because they don't understand it. So, we have more behavioral issues, we have the language issues, we have parents who are uninvolved because they're busy working. We have economic issues because some of the children don't get the basic services that they need because the parents don't know how to reach out for them. There are just so many issues. And then when we try to give them these standardized tests and try to bring them up to that standard, these tests are just so culturally foreign to them that even if they wanted to do well, just the content of this information is just
It's
so
foreign.
alien to them, they can't do well. So if we give them a paragraph that talks about something that we do in American culture, and they come from a nation that is totally unfamiliar with that type of thinking, uh, even if they're not that far below reading standard, they're not going to understand it anyway. So there are just so many things involved in trying to make this, cookie cutter, one size fits all approach. And okay, if we can get the passage rates up to like uh, 10% more on this test, and we can say our children are learning. They're not really learning. They're not really comprehending. It doesn't mean anything to them. I've spent as much as 6 or 7 weeks in a classroom trying to prepare children for one of these standardized tests. And again, how much time do we take out of the general curriculum to prepare them for tests? An awful lot of time,
So
and
so
it's
they can meet the
meaningless.
benchmark, so they can get more of
Right.
something. This just let me interject here. So what I'm hearing you say is there's a lot of resources and time being spent to say, okay, let's see if we can get them to pass this test because someone out there has decided that this test means if you can pass it at a certain level, that you're now educated. Is that correct?
That's basically the whole idea of Common Core.
And of Common Core. So here's what, for those of you listening, some of you have listened for a long time. One of the things that I'm passionate about is inspiring parents to step up. In other words, I think it was a man named Neil Maxwell who said something like this. I'm probably misquoting it, but it was something like this. If we don't fix marriages and families, parents, everything else we do will be like straightening deck chairs on the Titanic. In other words, we can throw money at it. We can throw money through social programs, through a lot more spending in education. We can do lots of different things. And I'm not saying that education programs aren't valuable. I'm not saying that there's not a number of awesome, wonderful social programs or teachers or things that we can do to help people. But if that quote is true, that if we don't get parents and marriages, families fixed and step up, that everything else we do, because these facts that we have to learn, as you said, we need the values, the principles, those things I think are best taught in the home. Now, they could be accentuated and taught by wonderful educators like yourself, by other people who are committed to teaching values and skills, not just trying to have people memorize facts. But we need parents to step up and say, you know what? I'm not just going to pawn it off to the school and hope. What I'm going to do is say, I'm the CEO of my children's education. And if the educational, as a CEO, you might say, the public school I'm sending them to now isn't working out, and I'm going to need to switch schools. I may need to switch to something else. Maybe I need to do, a charter school or a public school, maybe even a private school or a homeschool. But somehow I need to step up and say, you know what, the buck stops with me, and I'm responsible for educating these values to my children. And I hope to find some great teachers that I can work with at various possible schools. But if people aren't measuring up, or if the contractor that I'm working with isn't measuring up, I have a right as a CEO to say, I'm going to look elsewhere. right?
Exactly. So if somebody's measuring up, ultimately they're going to be fired or they're going to leave the position. And we can't run a company with people who don't adhere to the basic values of the company and who don't work hard to promote and respect it. So parents have to realize, and I think the tide is slowly changing, that there are a lot of options out there. Now, of course, you know, parents are very busy. They only have so many hours a day, but there are alternatives available to them. So you mentioned charter schools. That's one good avenue. And again, in some places of our country, charter schools are doing very well. There are charter schools for different reasons. Some of them specialize in a certain discipline, or they have a special focus, like a charter school for the arts or a charter school uh, for a particular discipline like science or math. But there are other charter schools that can enhance a child's overall living experience. Like a charter school can have a good academic grounding and then have an optional secondary focus like music or the arts. So the child can still get a very strong academic education and then maybe learn a lot about drawing or learn more about technology or learn more about becoming an artist. So there's that aspect of charter schools, and charter schools uh, can be run through the public system or they can be very much independent. I think we need a lot more vocational schools. There are a lot of children who are very gifted with their hands and who would love to get experience in a career involving that. So in our country, vocational schools are pretty, in most cases looked down upon or not considered nearly as important. And that's part of the reason that our economy has done so poorly in the manufacturing and in that whole area of possibilities for growth. So we could have children that are interested in automotive or aviation industries, and that could be supported and pushed forward as well. Homeschooling, a lot of parents think of as, oh, this is really difficult. I could never do that. But there's so many options with homeschooling too. It doesn't have to be a homeschool one-on-one in your home. It could be a co-op. And after COVID, a lot of parents did this when they became disenchanted because their children weren't learning through the traditional online programming that was offered through their public school. They started to form homeschool co-ops. So they got together, either themselves alternating teaching or hiring a group of teachers. And then that became a social experience as well because the children could learn independently in their own home, or they might be able to go to local uh, homes in their area, and that also would provide a degree of socialization as well. There are so many forms of homeschooling. There's Montessori homeschooling, there's Waldorf homeschooling. Some parents actually took their children on the road and they went on the road and they took their children with them and they did on the road schooling in a camper or a trailer. There are just so many possibilities and so many ways of doing it, depending on what's good for your family and what could work with your family. Because a lot of parents did a lot of work from home and became aware that they weren't so tied to, you know, going to work 9 to 5 in one location, and that gave them a lot of flexibility to do similar things with their family as well. So you can do it, and whether it's private school, charter school, vocational school, homeschooling options, there are other possibilities. And my personal philosophy is that the money for education should follow the student rather than all the money needs to be put into public education automatically. And if you want to choose something different, then well, that's tough luck. You're responsible for finding the money on your own. I think there has to be a lot more support for alternatives.
And that's refreshing to hear from you. I mean, tell us about your background as an educator lifelong in the public schools, even as a principal, correct? And you're still saying what I'm hearing you say is it should follow the student. They should be able to choose and go to it to use it for a different option.
I think that works best. And personally, I've done it all. I worked in a private elementary school. I worked in a public school. I've worked as a special education team teacher. So I worked with students that had special needs and were in a classroom together with general needs students. I worked with reading programs for dyslexic students, like the Wilson Reading Program. And I worked in special ed as a principal of a special ed preschool. And then I have also worked one-on-one intensively with special needs students. So children that actually need one-on-one training, children like autistic children who need a very individualized approach, like applied behavioral analysis. So I've done that as well. So I've worked one-on-one. I've worked in a small group setting with just special needs. I've worked in an integrated setting with both general needs and special education. And I've been an administrator, on the administration side as a principal and a district administrator as well. So I've kind of been exposed to all of the different approaches. It kind of accumulated gradually over this long period of time, but it's really led me to the belief that what works for one child doesn't work for all, and there are ways to individualize education, and that I'm like totally against this cookie cutter, one size fits all for every child.
And would you agree that parents know their children's better than
Of course, of course, who can know? But a parent also knows their child best, but a parent also has the responsibility to educate that child at home, to teach the child by modeling. And it's again, some parents might say, well, but where am I going to get the time to do this? If you integrate it every day with your child, again, critical thinking, asking them those open-ended questions, the who, the what, the when, the where, and why. Oh, I wonder why. And then just ask them open-ended questions. When your child says something, don't answer with a yes or a no. Ask them again. This changes according to age. When they're young, it's more limited. But as they grow older, ask them what they think. Ask for their opinion, and then ask them why they think that way. Give them chores to do, make them responsible. We don't do our children any favors by being helicopter parents that assume responsibility for everything a child does. And then when a child makes a mistake, we cover up for that mistake, or we say, oh, that's okay. We have to teach them to accept responsibility, to, love them unconditionally, but praise them when they're right. And when they're wrong, make sure that they understand that they're accountable. Not condemning them and punishing, but in the traditional, well, now you're grounded for 6 months, but teach them why it was wrong and then show them how to do it better next time. All of this kind of thing helps to give them a foundation in leadership skills, make them independent thinkers, make them have responsibility, make them understand what's fair and unfair, make them understand that sometimes we need to negotiate things. There's not always that black and white answer. Sometimes we have to understand the problem, go into it, and parents have to take responsibility too. When the parent is wrong, the parent needs to acknowledge that and tell the child, well, I was wrong in this instance. They have to be able to, see that we are all human beings and that, we're not right 100% of the time. We have to uh, teach them how to organize. That's another important skill. We're
One of the
so
things that comes to mind
flustered
is
today.
yeah, excuse me. I should say one of the things that comes to mind when you say this, I heard somebody say there are three things that are important when teaching. The first is example, the second is example, the third is example, right? You talked about the importance of being example or modeling. Hey, it's okay to admit you're wrong and go back and try to make it better. Say, I messed up, but I shouldn't have done that, and I'm sorry. And teaching them so they can see you do it, right?
Exactly. Yep. But if they see the parent as that kind of, well, either one extreme or the other, the authoritarian parent who's always right and, you're going to do it because I said you're going to do it. And then that opposite extreme of the helicopter parent who's always hovering and protecting the child from, you know, being harmed or injured in any way. We learn more from our mistakes than we do from our successes. So, failure is an important part of growing up. Letting children pursue their passions and pursue things that they're interested in, knowing that they're not going to succeed 100% of the time. Now, they might think that they're going to be the greatest baseball player ever, but it turns out they can't catch a ball to save their life. I mean, they have to learn, they wanted to try it and they have to see, well, this isn't working out for me. So maybe I should try something else, and then let them try something else, and and then of course we have, again, the parents that have their heart set on a child following in their footsteps, and, well, I was really great at music, so you're going to be great at music too. Maybe not, so don't try to force your children into things just because you decide, well, I think this would be a good path for my child. Let the
Right.
child find his or her own
I,
path.
I like that how you said that. So it's not when we're talking about being a CEO, it's not saying, hey, this is what you need to do all the time. It's just saying, hey, I can find out what my children are interested in and then provide opportunities. I may, if they're interested in music, I may decide to get them involved with a piano teacher or a violin teacher, or if they, or somebody may want to hire a karate teacher or something, but help them learn, but also don't, what I'm hearing you say, and let me get your opinion on a couple things here. I heard it said that if a child were to fall down and skin his knee, and if the parent runs up and says, "Oh my goodness, coochie coochie coo, I cannot believe that you her skinned your knee, and let's help you." The kid almost, the unspoken sentence is, "Hey, you're fragile, and you need someone to, you're breakable." On the other hand, if your kid skins his knee and the parent says, "You know what? Sometimes that happens, and I've skinned my knee and I know it hurts, but you're going to be okay. You can shake it off." And then when they skin their knee and mom and dad aren't there, they kind of have that voice in their head that I'm going to be okay. It's not a big deal. Rather than that I'm fragile. And I think when parents helicopter, the unspoken thing that they may not say it out loud, but the unspoken thing is you're fragile and you can't live without me. So I've got to helicopter in and save you, rather than, hey, you're a capable person and you're going to be able to be strong enough to figure this out. That's the unspoken message to
Yes.
the kid is, I need mom and dad to rescue me because I'm weak or I'm fragile or there's something wrong with me.
And it
Rather
doesn't
than,
encourage independence, right? I mean, so then the child's going to need, well, I need somebody else to support me all the time, whether that's a parent or later on in life, the child is going to grow into an adult who feels like they always need a crutch to,
be that
to
someone else or the
succeed.
government or anything. You're correct. Let me ask you one more question. Tell me, I'd love to hear your opinion on this. I had my brother who also loves education. Some people are concerned that if they homeschool, that their kids won't be socialized. And my brother said that there were some studies done that showed that the kids are about as social as their parents. In other words, if the parent can carry on a conversation, some people are afraid, well, if I homeschool, my kids will be backwards. And you already addressed some of those things with, you could do a co-op. But there's a lot of socialization in schools that is not positive. There's a lot of bullying. There's a lot of,
Yes.
like, you've got to conform and have exactly the right clothes, otherwise you're not cool. That's negative socialization that we don't want. But if we as parents can say, I mean, from what my brother said is that if parents are somewhat social and socialized and can hold on conversation, their kids will be about as socialized, even if they homeschool or not. And tell me your feeling on that.
Well, I think a lot of that is in the child's individual personality. Of course, some children are naturally shy, and others are more outgoing. And a lot of it does have to do with their family system, how the parents interact with the outside world. Some parents are more, reticent. They're not. They don't belong to a lot of clubs. They don't have a lot of interest, but because again, some of them might be working long hours and so on. But there are again ways to do it with homeschooling. Uh, the kids can meet their peers in so many ways. It could be through a sports team, it could be through an outside interest like music or the arts. It could just be taking them to the local library and going to library events. It could be taking them to local community events. Whatever resources you have in the community on the weekends, taking them to a museum or taking them to an event in the community, whether it be a holiday parade or whatever is going on at the time. uh, there are lots of ways to meet other people in the community. There are just really so many opportunities out there. So I don't think that has to be a drawback. And again, there are many parents who homeschool and who are able to hook up with after school activities in the local schools. So even if your child doesn't attend the local public school, or there could be a local private school as well, in most cases, a child could join a team at the local school, or it could be something like Girl Scouts or Boy Scouts, or some other group, 4-H in rural communities. There are a lot of opportunities for joining groups out that aren't 100% linked to the school system. So you don't have to belong to the high school uh, tennis team, but you might belong to a local tennis club, or there might be a private school that has a tennis group, and the child could enjoy that. So I personally know some parents. I know I have one parent in mind who homeschooled her child from elementary right up through high school. And she went one day a week after school, and she participated in a local group that was affiliated with that school and had lots of friends from the school. So even though she was homeschooled, she had lots of friends in the community that went to that public school. So
In
it
other
doesn't
words,
mean one or the other.
in other words, she was socialized just fine, even though she was homeschooled. I
Right.
know that's a common concern with some parents. They say, well, my kids will be backward if they go homeschool. So that's good to know. Let me ask you one more question about this. I wish I remembered the study. There was a study where they said the education outcomes in large part are linked to the number of turns in a conversation. So in other words, I'm saying something and then you're responding, that's one turn in the conversation. And then if you say something to me and I respond, that's another turn in the conversation. And a lot of these and again, I wish I had the study, but it was basically an intelligence study was linked to how many times these turns in the conversation happen. So in a public school setting or a large classroom setting of some sort, a lot of times it's just the teacher talking, and some of it's going over the head. Some of the kids are spaced out. Some of them are getting it. Some of them aren't. And there's unfortunately, in some situations, very few turns in a conversation. In a homeschooling situation, it seems to me like the parents would have a lot of opportunity to increase the number of turns in a conversation. So in other words, if your child comes to you and says, hey, I'd really like to understand more about George Washington, since we're talking about history. And you say, well, what is it about George Washington that you're curious about? And he said, well, I heard this story about so-and-so. Well, there's two or three turns in the conversation right there. And as a homeschooler or a parent who was just trying to educate their kids, being willing to do what you said, well, and ask them questions, open-ended questions, so they're thinking and the conversation's going back and forth, that's associated with having higher levels of intelligence. Tell me your thoughts on that.
Yeah, not only that, but you can learn so much about their individual interests. So in the course of those conversations, you can
Yes.
redirect the curriculum and bring them more in line with the resources that they're interested. So they say they're interested in something, and you probe them to understand what exactly it is they're interested in and why. And then you could say, well, we can go to the library, or we can
Right.
go to the local museum, or we can go visit that local historical site to find out more about that person. And it's kind of the beginning of a ripple effect. So one thing leads into another. Instead of just going to the internet and typing in a question and finding the answer, you're continuing that conversation, and you're opening it up to so many other avenues of exploration. It could go almost anywhere
I love that.
depending
And then they're more invested in it because they have the question, and mom and dad are helping me go down this path to learn. And now something I'm interested is important to mom and dad or my parents as well. And so we're able to learn together rather than I just put in the cookie cutter and hope that I come out okay. Right. Like
exactly, it's interactive. And the whole, one of the most important pieces of critical thinking and learning history is, focusing on that problem, but then testing the different possibilities. So just like in the science experiment, you have a hypothesis and then you change the variables and you see what affect different variables. Well, in history, you're asking different questions and going down different avenues, and then you're getting more information. You're putting it together, and then you're analyzing it, and then you're also inferring and taking other information that you have found out from your other research into that topic, and you're putting it all together, which gives you an opportunity to come to some real conclusion, not just something that's somebody's opinion. And sometimes you'll come to a very definite conclusion about something, and sometimes you won't come to any conclusion at all. Or maybe you'll conclude that there are multiple possibilities and multiple reasons and multiple avenues that you could pursue, in order to learn more about this topic. So again, it's open ended. It's forcing a child to really, really think and use real information, not opinions and, the stuff we get on social media and what everybody else thinks, but information that I myself have gone to the trouble to learn about and then think about and then analyze and form my own conclusions, not somebody else's conclusion.
And it sounds like that's a great way for parents to help their children become critical thinkers. In other words,
Yeah, I think
not be so influenced by whatever the latest social media something is.
the best kind of parent to me is a mentor, a kind of a teacher, but someone who is willing to listen more than talk. To it's so important to really listen to your child. And if you ask those open-ended questions, you're going to get a lot of information. You will learn really what your child thinks, not just the yes, the no. Yeah. What did you do at school today? Nothing. I mean, well, what happened in math class? Did you did you do something different? Did you practice what you did before? You know, or what happened at lunchtime? Who were you talking to? Did
Yeah,
you
tell me
make any
about it.
plans for the weekend? You know,
Mm.
you have to kind of draw them out, and not accept that. Yeah, no, no.
And that goes back to that, Stephen Covey wrote this book called The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. He said people who were effective, one of those 7 habits was effective people seek first to understand before they try to be understood. So instead of always trying to help your children understand what you're thinking,
Hmm.
try to understand them first before you try to be understood, and then your ability to influence them, or help them find their way goes up because they feel understood and you've talked to them.
That's what I mean. Most children really want to be understood, and when they many of the times when they rebel, it's because they feel that they're not understood. That's exactly the reason for
What a
the
good key.
negative behavior.
If you want to lessen rebellion in your children, perhaps just be quiet and listen and help them feel understood. Correct.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Um, One last thing I wanted your opinion on. I've heard that they did some studies on some kids who, after school, they found that if they only read a minute, they were generally on the lower end of the scale. Like the F and D students would only read about a minute or less after school, but the A- kids would read about 19 or 20 minutes. And so it was really only a difference of 20 minutes reading after school. And now I'm not saying it's causation. We know that correlation is not causation, but it seems like it was at least associated with higher outcomes when people would learn to read on their own that wasn't a school assignment. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I always, from the time a child is very young, I started with my children when they were 3. I brought them to the library. I let them go into the children's section and I just let them wander around to see what they would pick, what they would choose.
Mm.
Uh, Allow your children to pursue curiosity into what they're interested in initially. They'll read a lot more if they're interested in what they're reading. So
Mm.
even with middle school children, even if it's comic books or graphic novels, it's important to get them just to be interested in reading, first of all. Then, you can kind of help them to channel their interests into other things. So just as long as they're reading, and then help them choose the right kind of books as they get a little bit older and the child is actually able to read, you know, don't let them pick books that are too easy. There's that classic five-finger reading approach. So, if a child picks up a book and one word on any random page is too difficult, then that's probably a good book for the child. If there are two words on the page that the child doesn't understand, that's still probably a good bet because it'll stretch them a little bit, but not frustrate them. But if there are three or more words on the page that the child, really doesn't have a clue, then that's not a good book for the child. So, always try to have them reach a little bit, but not something that's going to totally frustrate them. Because children that are way behind in reading, when they go into the classroom, if the book is too difficult, they're just gonna shut down. And model reading for the child. If the child sees a parent reading, the child will say, "Oh, I guess reading really is important." It is, it's just like kind of a psychological mental thing. But oh, my dad reads, so my not that they have to
Well,
read.
going back
Uh,
to that modeling example piece you were talking about, which is so important, the best to model.
exactly. And no matter what it is, whether it's a newspaper, a magazine, you know, whatever it is, it's important that the child sees the parent reading. So, oh, this is an important skill. You can help them so many ways in the community. When you go to the store, ask the child to look at the label, ask the child to read you the label. When you're driving, ask the child, oh, did you see that sign? What does that sign say? I missed it. See if the child can read the sign. There's so many opportunities for them every day just walking around in the community to practice reading.
So really appreciate your perspective on this, Barbara. Let me ask you one last question here. Well, maybe more than one last, but one that came back to me. Why is it important from a historical perspective to have parents help children understand their cultural heritage? And then how can you help them understand and appreciate it?
Well, I think it's important that the child feels connected, first of all, to the family unit. And as the child grows, to understand why that family unit does certain things and the way they do them. So if a child is part of a family that's first generation or second generation, that those cultural things will be a lot stronger. But again, going back to those who, what, when, where, why questions, the first thing a child wants to know is who am I, where did I come from, and how do I fit in? So you can make those things important in your family. You can talk about the things that you did when you were little. You can talk about the things that your parents did. You could talk about the places you went to, the foods you ate, uh, the events that were important to you. You can encourage a child to ask the parents and grandparents about it, because if you talk about it, then they're going to start thinking about those things, and then they're going to be more curious, and they're going to go to the uncle, the cousin, the grandparent, and ask them, well, how did you do this, or what was your school like, or what kind of food did you eat when you were a little kid? They're just, if you model it, if you show it, if you take them to local community events, if there's a cultural event going on in your community, whether it's your culture or a different culture, expose them to that. And then your child will be asking, well, why did they dress that way? Why did they play that instrument? Or you know, why were they dancing that way? Why were they acting that way? You can open up all kinds of new cultural avenues, because first a child learns about their family's customs and traditions, whether that be religion, or whether it be the food they eat, or whether it be uh, places that they go to with family members. Then that can be brought out into the community, and they can see friends, because sometimes it comes through their peer group. They have friends that belong to different cultures, and they can learn about the other cultures that way. But sometimes it just happens by walking around the community. If encourage a child to ask, to inquire. They notice somebody dresses differently. They notice somebody reacts differently. That they have certain terms in their language that mean certain things that the child isn't familiar with. Just encourage them to ask, and to inquire, and then to share, what's important to them, what's important to you. Encourage them to have those conversations with other families in your community. You can invite a family from a different culture over, and just talk with them, and expose your child to that as well.
These are wonderful ideas. I really, really appreciate your insight. I mean, I really appreciate your insight on this, especially with your background in education. All of these good points and tips for parents to become better educators, to become more adept at being CEOs. And it sounds like one of the themes that you've continually brought up here is to listen, and to talk, and to have conversations, and encourage them to ask you questions, and have them feel like they can ask you questions, and then teach them about their heritage, teach them about their history, teach them the values and the principles and the skills, rather than just, hey, you got to learn these facts and spit them out on a test. That's so important today. What would you say, if there's one thing you would tell parents who are listening to this show that you think is important from your perspective? Is there one thing that you would say, remember this as you're trying to educate your children?
Well, so many things. I would say listen more than you talk, and practice what you preach.
Wow, so profound. Listen more than you talk, and remember that you're talking a lot as you're doing your example. So profound. Thank you, Barbara. Such an honor to have you on the show today. How can people get a hold of you, Barbara?
Well, the best place to get a hold of me is on my website. So my website is simply littlemisshistory.com. Little Miss History is the character that I use in my children's book series. So I have a book series with a cartoon character who narrates history for children. And the books are done with this critical thinking in mind. So they are books that not only give children information and entertain them, but they encourage children to be interactive with that information, and to think on their own, and then express their own opinions about what we talk about. So that's my book series. So on my website, there are links to the books. I have a blog, and on the blog, I review children's books, and I talk about a lot of the things we talked about. I have tips and teaching on my blog. I have a YouTube channel, and I do mini teaching lessons on my YouTube channel, as well as present informational videos on things like critical thinking, how to figure out facts and opinions, and to use different parts of the curriculum and set up your own teaching lessons. So they're called 2-Minute Teacher, and I give mini teaching lesson that parents or teachers could use with their children. So I have that, and they can look at all of my resources. I have a Pinterest board where I collect things for parents and teachers that they might want to use with students, either at home or in the classroom. And I have my social media channels that also present different ways of contacting me. So that one website, you can click on any of those links to get to where you want to go. And I also have an instant chat on there. So if anyone wants to email me or chat, they're welcome to do that as well.
So wonderful for that resource. So littlemisshistory.com. And you could also reach out to social media links. We'll try to have those in the show notes today. And Barbara, thank you so much for being on the show. For any of you parents who want a resource, please visit littlemisshistory.com and reach out to Barbara for any of your parenting educational questions. And thank you for being on the show today, Barbara.
Thank you so much. I enjoyed chatting with you, Exon.
I am so jealous of my wife because she gets the ultimate career. She gets to train and nurture and love our children more than I get to because I have to be doing things like this podcast. Parenting's the ultimate career. If you like what you heard today, please like, subscribe, comment, leave a review. Thank you for listening. You can also check out my book, What I Want My Children to Know Before I Die. It's available on Amazon and other bookstores. Thanks again for listening.